For more than 50 years, Paul McCartney stayed quiet while the world pointed fingers at Yoko Ono, blaming her for the breakup of the Beatles. He let people believe that version of the story, even though it wasn't the full truth. Now, at 83, Paul is finally speaking out, and what he reveals is far more complicated, emotional, and painful than anyone ever expected. His words show that the end of the Beatles wasn't just about Yoko. It was about the pressures of fame, personal struggles, and growing tensions within the group that had been building for years. In the early 1960s, the Beatles became the biggest band in the world almost overnight. Fans screamed everywhere they went, tours sold out, and the media followed their every move. On the surface, they looked like four young men living a dream, but behind the smiles and catchy songs, the cracks were already forming. The endless pressure of fame, constant touring, and lack of privacy took a toll. By 1966, they could no longer take the chaos of live shows. The noise drowned out their music, and the stress wore them down. So, they stopped touring and focused only on studio work. At first, this seemed like a solution, but it had the opposite effect. Without the bond of live performance, they spent long hours in studios, locked in creative disagreements, and slowly drifted apart. The Beatles were no longer just a band. They had become a business, a brand, and a symbol of an era. Every decision was tied to their image and the opinions of managers and outsiders. Each member began moving in his own direction. John Lennon became more interested in politics and self-exploration than in the group. George Harrison turned inward, focusing on spirituality and his own songwriting. Ringo's star often felt overshadowed and disconnected. Paul, desperate to hold the group together, pushed for discipline and structure in the studio. He worked hard to keep the spark alive, but his strong leadership started to feel like control to the others. George, in particular, felt unheard and undervalued, even as his songwriting talent grew. The harmony that once defined the group turned into a struggle for control, with each Beatle pulling in a different direction. The loss of live shows made things worse. Without the energy of fans and the bond of traveling together, their connection grew cold. They stopped feeling like brothers and started feeling more like co-workers. Paul later admitted, "We were no longer a band. We were just four guys in different orbits." They had achieved everything possible, but instead of bringing them closer, success left them isolated from each other. For decades, people blamed Yoko Ono for breaking up the Beatles. Her constant presence in the studio and her deep bond with John Lennon made her an easy target. Fans and the media painted her as the outsider who destroyed their chemistry. But the truth is more complicated. By the time Yoko appeared, the band was already pulling apart. John was emotionally distant, searching for something new, and Yoko gave him that through art, ideas, and a powerful personal connection. Her presence in the studio felt strange to the others because it broke an unspoken rule. The band's work was supposed to stay between the four of them. But it wasn't Yoko forcing her way in, it was John who wanted her by his side, even during recording. That choice changed the group's rhythm, but it was a symptom of the distance already growing, not the cause. Paul has since admitted that, while her presence hurt the group dynamic, he eventually came to understand how much John needed her. The idea that Yoko single-handedly destroyed the Beatles is an oversimplification of a much deeper story. The cracks had been forming long before, and Yoko only made them visible to the world. She didn't come in and break the band apart. She stepped into a group that was already falling to pieces. The Beatles were fading, and Yoko Ono became the easiest person to blame. She once explained that being accused of breaking up the Beatles felt like being charged with murder when the victim was already dying. Paul now agrees with her. He knows the band was already drifting, and blaming her alone was never fair. What the fans saw was just the surface. The real story was a slow collapse that had been happening long before. Each of the four Beatles was moving in a different direction. John was exploring experimental music and searching for emotional healing. Paul leaned toward polished production and memorable melodies. George wanted more space to grow as a songwriter, but he often felt pushed aside. Ringo was drained and unsure of where he fit in. They were no longer one team. They had become four individuals chasing four different visions. A big part of the tension came from John's shift into avant-garde art with Yoko. That change pushed Paul into survival mode. He wasn't battling Yoko, he was fighting to hold on to the Beatles' identity while John was chasing something completely new. Paul wanted to preserve the band, but John wanted to transform it. That gap left little room for healing, and it only made their disagreements worse. By 1969, the end became impossible to ignore. John Lennon told the others that he was leaving. The news stunned everyone, especially Paul. But instead of announcing it, they all agreed to stay quiet for business reasons. They wanted to protect their brand, finish contracts, and keep up appearances. For months, the band continued to work together in public, even though they knew the end was near. During this time, Paul poured his energy into new music. He still hoped he could hold things together. But when he released his first solo album, everything changed. The media spun the story into a headline: Paul had quit the Beatles. Overnight, he became the villain, the man who had supposedly destroyed the world's greatest band. But the truth was that John had left first. Paul had stayed silent to protect the band's reputation, and that silence came back to hurt him. The weight of being blamed crushed Paul. He and his wife, Linda, retreated to Scotland, where he struggled with depression, heavy drinking, and self-doubt. He thought his career might be over. It was the darkest chapter of his life. But Linda encouraged him to keep creating. Slowly, he began recording again, and out of those private sessions came the beginnings of Wings. Music became his way to climb back from the edge. Looking back now, Paul admits his silence was a choice. He didn't mind taking the blame if it meant protecting the image of the Beatles. To him, keeping the band's legacy intact mattered more than defending himself. He chose peace over public arguments. He carried the burden quietly so that the group wouldn't end with an ugly fight. What no one saw was the personal cost of that silence. Paul sacrificed his own reputation to keep the Beatles' story clean. The band didn't end with an explosion. It unraveled slowly. And now, after decades of silence, Paul has revealed the deeper truths, the real reasons the Beatles fell apart. It wasn't just one fight, one decision, or one person. It was years of creative differences, personal changes, and power struggles building up until the bond that held them together finally gave way. The biggest cracks came from inside. Lennon and McCartney's songwriting partnership, once seamless and magical, began to drift apart. John leaned into raw emotion, while Paul leaned into structure and polish. At the same time, George Harrison's songwriting blossomed, producing timeless tracks like Something and Here Comes the Sun. But despite the brilliance of his work, George still felt overlooked, trapped in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney. Paul himself later admitted that they hadn't given George enough credit or control, and that mistake planted deep resentment that quietly grew behind the scenes. The unity of the Beatles slowly broke down from the inside. The loss of Brian Epstein, their trusted manager and stabilizing guide, made everything worse. Without him, the group no longer had a clear leader, and decisions became difficult. Arguments increased, and the harmony they once had started to fall apart. What followed was a struggle for power. Paul wanted Linda's father, Lee Eastman, to manage the group, while John, George, and Ringo supported Alan Klein. This disagreement grew into a messy legal battle that pushed them even further apart. In the end, Paul sued the others, not because he wanted to hurt them, but because he wanted to protect the Beatles' work and keep their music from being mishandled. The lawsuit shocked fans, and many thought Paul was being cold. But his true reason was about protecting the legacy, the money, and the years of work they had built together. Outside of business, their personal lives were also moving in different directions. John was exploring art and politics with Yoko. George was turning to spirituality and his solo music. Paul was still working hard to produce and arrange, trying to keep things alive. Ringo often felt caught in the middle, unsure of where he belonged. They weren't the young band of brothers anymore. They had become four adults with different goals, beliefs, and priorities. What once felt like friendship and joy had turned into a tense working relationship. There was no one huge fight that ended everything, just a long series of small disagreements that added up. Another thing that made matters worse was their silence. To protect their image, they kept their problems hidden from the public. This silence allowed myths to grow, and fans thought everything was fine, until the truth came crashing down. That gap between their public image and private reality made the breakup even more shocking when it finally happened. Now, at 83, Paul is no longer carrying the burden of those old rumors. He isn't rewriting history, he's finally making peace with it. For years, he let people believe he was the one who broke up the Beatles. He stayed quiet because he thought protecting the band's name was more important than defending himself. But now, with time and perspective, he's ready to tell the story honestly. Paul has spent decades reflecting on those years. He looks back on each bandmate with warmth and regret, seeing things with maturity instead of anger. He now admires the deep love John and Yoko shared. Back then, it felt disruptive, but now he respects the bond they had and understands why John wanted her always by his side. He also speaks about John with deep affection. Their arguments, he says, came not from hate but from closeness. He remembers George as a quiet genius who deserved far more recognition than he received. Paul admits one of his greatest regrets was not telling George often enough how talented he was. George wasn't a junior member, he was an equal, and Paul wishes he had said that more clearly. About Ringo, Paul calls him the heartbeat of the band. Dependable, steady, and always present, Ringo kept the Beatles together longer than anyone realized. His loyalty and calm presence made more of a difference than people knew. For Paul, the hardest part wasn't the breakup, it was the silence afterward. By staying quiet, he let false stories spread. He believed silence would protect the band's image, but instead, it only confused fans and made healing harder. He has spent years trying to make peace with that decision. Now, he can finally speak openly. Paul admits he never wanted to be remembered as the one who ended the Beatles. But he also feared what would happen if the band's collapse became public while it was happening. He chose silence, hoping the storm would pass. It didn't. But today, he's able to see it differently. He understands now that the breakup wasn't about blame, it was about timing, change, and growth. The Beatles didn't fall apart because of one person. They simply grew in different directions. Each member needed to find his own voice, and that couldn't happen within the same group. The breakup was painful, but it was also a natural part of life. Paul says if he could go back, he wouldn't change the fact that they split, but he would change how it was handled. He wishes he had spoken up sooner, told the truth earlier, and reminded everyone that, despite the tensions, they were still a family. Not a perfect family, not always kind, but still deeply connected. That is the lesson Paul carries now, and the peace he finally shares with the world.